the Luton Hat industry as told by people who worked in it. Philip Wright, a current hat factory owner, which is still operating, Andrew Olney and Howard Hudson, former factory owners, and Val Davey, who worked in a local hat factory. The Luton hat industry had its origins in the 1600s, grew and expanded, and by the 1900s it was estimated that Luton had 1,000 factories in the town. By the 1940s, Luton was making 50 million hats a year, which were sold all over the world. The 1950s and 60s saw the beginning of decline due to changes in fashion and competition from abroad. Now there are just 3 operating hat factories in Luton. People from all over the United Kingdom and the world came to Luton and worked in the hat industry.
My name's Philip Wright. I run my family firm, Walter Wright.
The founders of the company, Walter Wright and Minnie Susan, his wife, first opened their doors 2 hours after their wedding
In 1889 at our current address, 29 Albion Road, Luton. Picture is of the Wright family. The adults in the middle sitting down are my grandparents, Walter Philip Wright and Minnie Susan. The children in that picture, they all went on to manage or run or own hat factories in Luton, to the extent that each week there was a competition, if you like, between the 7 hat factories to see who could produce the first 1,000th dozen of the week. So that's 12,000 hats per factory, times 7 per week. And it was the factory that my grandfather ran, which is the one I bought from my father in '99. It was that factory that usually won the prize each week.
My name's Andrew Olney. I was formerly the managing director of a company called Olney Headwear Limited, who were located in the Old Bedford Road area of Luton. We're a family business of hat manufacturers. My brother David, myself, are the 4th generation of the Olney family to manufacture hats in Luton. We arrived in Luton in 1922 after the company was formed in 1914 in St Albans. The family then moved to Luton where the hat trade was growing. We moved to a factory in the Hightown area of Luton in York Street because it was very accessible to the station. So we needed the transport links in the early 20s because obviously things like the M1 didn't exist. So we started manufacturing in York Street and continued there until 1976 when Luton Council in their wisdom decided to compulsory purchase our factory, and with sufficient funds we were able to purchase our current factory, or as was our current factory, in the Old Bedford Road.
My name's Howard Hudson. I'm 76 years of age. I was born in Luton in 1944, and I grew up in Luton, and I worked in the hat trade all of my life until I left Luton in 2012. So in 1902, he and my grandmother decided to start manufacturing. My grandmother was very artistic and she was able to do the design. My grandfather had knowledge of manufacture, and also his great knowledge was in plaits, in grading plaits and knowing what sort of plaits would work for certain things. So they started the business, and that was known as Daniel Burgess Millinery. And my mother, again, was a designer. She was born in 1908. She worked with her parents. Was in 1941, mother decided that she would go into the model end and became C.M. Hudson Model Millinery. Mother had her factory in Princess Street, in Hastings Street, had a factory at the back of the house. So the dwellings were at the front of the property, and then at the rear of the property was a small factory.
My name is Valerie Davey. When I was younger, I went to Canterbury and trained in the millinery for making hats. And when I finished my 3-year course, I went to London to work in the hat factory. And then I actually went to work in another hat factory in Luton. The hat factory that I worked in was called Morris Davis. It was in Guildford Street. And I was taken on, employed as being the supervisor of the workroom and the designer. And while I was in the hat factory, my job was to look after the team of workers in the room. Some of them were machinists, some of them were using glue guns. And also I had to do the outdoor work. I had to make all the boxes up and put all the work in and all the fabric that would be sent out to our outdoor workers. It's where the company sends you work in boxes. You have about 6 or more boxes, and inside those boxes, there is a hat that you have to follow, a design, and then you hand sew to do the hats. It's all hand sewn. Everything is there in the box for you. And when you finished it, you put it back in the boxes and they come along and pick it up and it goes to the factory.
The hat trade evolved over hundreds of years to eventually become what it is known for historically in Luton. The Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire counties, the soil and the climate were very good for growing long straw. And this straw meant that it could be plaited, woven, if you like. And it was used in a variety of industries, bag making, furniture, but also it was discovered that if you sewed this plait together round and round like that, it meant that you could start to create the basic sort of material to make a very durable straw hat. Over the centuries, it became a very good subsidiary income to the families in the 3 counties. Other than, you know, the main breadwinner would have been the father, but it meant that the children, the wives and the elders of the community could also work at home cottage industry. They would either do the plaiting, or they would be sewing the plait together, or they'd be making the hats. It was that important that they started to create schools to teach the children from an early age how to plait. The railway station was built at Luton, and this was the new way of getting your products around the country. All industry, but particularly the hat trade, moved from the various towns within the 3 counties to Luton, which was when Luton became the sort of epicenter and worldwidely unique, primarily therefore down to the railway.
Okay, during the 1920s, we were predominantly a straw hat manufacturer, so we only made hats from the local straw. We were very famous for making the traditional Luton boater, which you'll be familiar of with the Luton Town Football Club. So we manufactured boaters for them for many years. We did policemen's helmets, we did all sorts of things. It went into school wear as well. At one time, every school child would wear a hat.
And hats in England were made in Luton. Populations increased, so therefore Luton just made more and more hats. The industry expanded. So we had, I believe, I'm told that we had approximately 1,000 hat factories in Luton by the turn of the century, the sort of 1910. The industry employed 1/3 of the population of the town and surrounding area. This work, in the meantime, though, this availability, it was popular because people wanted work outside the 3 counties, outside Luton, and not just from England itself. So Luton has always been a focus for people to come, live and get work because of its industry. If you like, privileged, blessed to be introduced to so many different cultures of people who have come into the country over the years. I remember the migrants then, now British, most definitely, when they came in from after the war in India, Pakistani, Bangladesh, Kenya, the Asian people from Kenya when they were thrown out by the regime. We've had, before that, we had Jewish immigrants, Russians, Polish, Portuguese, and then of course after the Second World War we had quite a lot of Italians. So each period, each decade, if you like, saw a turnover of different cultures who all left their mark, and certainly their stories and their memories and their fun. The hat trade, or hats in general, it goes beyond borders and cultures, because anybody involved in the hat trade is good by my book, and slightly weird or eccentric or different. And so it bonded all different cultures together, and it was really, obviously nothing stays the same. Interest in hats, therefore, started to wane. In the 1950s, ladies still wouldn't walk outside their house without wearing a hat. But over a period of generations, and fashion goes round, it might be popular, but then it will decline. So fashion comes around, but the non-wearing of hats stayed. So less hats were worn, less demand. We, as a factory, we evolved with that. We got smaller. My great-grandmother employed 1,000 staff more. My great-grandfather, he would have employed about 800. My father employed about 400. I employed, my busiest time, I employed 35, which is a much smaller amount of people.
We carried on into the 50s and 60s making blocked hats. It then started to decline later on in the 60s, and we then had to develop our uniform business. But we would still source all the materials ourselves. So all the materials we would source from around the world. So, for example, our Panama hats that we used to block in Luton were hand woven in Ecuador in the early 90s, as shops then became very driven by costs. And so we were then really hit hard by the fact that buyers would come in, and the first thing they would ask is how much is your hat? It changed, and we had to change with it. So we made sure that our hats and caps were of the highest quality. We used the best materials that we could get, and we never took shortcuts. It was always very important that every one of our caps and hats made was of the same standard. So we were very, very strict on our quality. And then into the sort of 2000s, we started to make tweed caps, and that was then picked up by the production team for the television series Peaky Blinders. That got the cap very famous, which started actually developing our internet business. In the early 80s, we eventually built the workforce up to some 70 staff. Unfortunately, the problem we then encountered was an economic one, and we were then up against other companies in the town. Obviously, in the hat trade, there were one or two companies that were of a similar size to ourselves, so there was competition for wages and salaries in that way. But our biggest competition came from the sort of multinational companies, so the Vauxhall Motors, the airport, as it started to grow in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were paying a lot more than it was economically viable for the hat trade to be able to afford or to pay. And that was when we started really seeing a skill shortage, which eventually with the push on prices and the amount we could charge for our headwear led us to diversify and move in some of our bulkier production abroad. And this we did by moving production firstly to the Czech Republic and then eventually to Poland and some to China, which again allowed us in Luton to concentrate on the highly skilled, more expensive headwear.
Fortunately, probably, a company in Ireland, a couple of guys from Balbriggan, just outside of Dublin, had rung me up and asked me whether or not they'd heard that I had some knowledge and would I go out to China and set up a production plant for them out in China, which I did, a little bit against my disgust, because I felt that the trade that I'd known and had given me a very good living all my life, being a managing director of 2 companies, I thought, well, I'm now taking all that knowledge and giving it to somebody else who was really our direct competitor. They were concentrating on the hunting, fishing and shooting side. They were doing outdoor clothing, waxwear, etc. But they felt that there was a demand for wax hats. I encouraged them that there was a far greater demand for formal wear for weddings, and there were certainly other things that they could be done. And they said, would I go out to China? And I did just that. We started off with a factory in Suzhou, well, in Shanghai to start with. Then we went to Suzhou and then down into Gucci. And I did that until 2012. From my experience in China, I could quite easily see why the Chinese were able to produce their products so cheaply and became so competitive. It was a great shame that we had to lose it, but that was as it was.
In sort of 2015, 2016, with the idea that we would then move out of our very large factory in Old Bedford Road. The plan was to relocate to the outskirts of the town with our small number of dedicated staff so that we could then have a smaller production facility and keep our costs down. Unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic or the start of the pandemic, non-essential retail virtually closed down overnight. If it wasn't for our very strong online presence and our internet sales, I think it probably would have completely forced us out of business. And really, this with the change in retail from retail to online sales sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back, basically. And we were forced into a decision that in 2019 we would actually close the business down and not relocate, which was a great shame after 105, 106 years. That was the economic reality of the type of work we were doing. I'm
very, very proud still to be a Lutonian and to be involved in the hat trade throughout my life. Certainly gave me a living. And I'm still very proud to say that I'm the 3rd generation of my family that were involved in making ladies' hats. And for that reason and that reason alone, I think it's highly commendable that anybody should be proud to be a Lutonian.
It hasn't changed. We use the same machinery. We have a few more tricks up our sleeve on how to make stuff, but essentially the machinery, the methodology, the handwork, it's all the same. How do you make a hat? You've got to make it by hand, and it ain't broke, so we don't mend it.
No.
So yeah, the hat trade declined. So from 1,000 hat factories in the early 1900s, 1,000 hat factories in Luton, that has now become 3. We are very much a disappearing craft. What can you do in a country that is beginning to enjoy the fun of hats again, but now the volume of hats that would be considered an industry, that volume is no longer made in England. And despite whatever some people hope or think, that industry can return to the country, it's the knowledge, a knowledge that has been built up over hundreds of years, that has been handed down to the next generation. That knowledge isn't written in a book. It is by word of mouth, by doing, by seeing, by observing, by copying. And those people, they're gone. So the knowledge of how to make them, not just hats, anything, it would be difficult for industry just to suddenly come back to this country, because there's no one actually now who knows how to do it. So that's fine. It's what it is. We are proud of what we have done. We're proud of what we do. And we might probably be missed in years to come.